rests over at Mount Tomah, the Darug and the Gundungurra people, and on the land in which we're talking today. This photo here is of grinding grooves on a ridgeline that I get to look at every day, and I think it's really important to just put that caveat on everything we're talking about today with respect to traditional owners, that a lot of this knowledge and some of the things that we're talking about were known for tens of thousands of years, just in different forms. And when we're talking about habitat and the importance of hollows, I'm sure the traditional owners were very aware of that. And we want to try and incorporate a lot of that knowledge respectfully, and hopefully incorporate that into the things we're doing to manage this ecosystem and do the wonderful conservation work we're doing. So, to give it a little bit of context, I'm going to be talking about a tree habitat creation project that we've been doing, but very much more about botanic gardens and how we are making changes to manage our gardens and our plant collections in ways that are ecologically literate and informed by the way in which these plants grow in the wild. You know, so often we garden things, we're very human, and we tend to do horticulture, and we clean things up and we tidy things up and we think we're doing the right thing. And that's changing a lot. And botanic gardens are a little slow. A lot of us are very colonial institutions, so we're even slower than the rest. But we're making big changes there, and I'm hoping today we can sort of show that and also help influence some of the things you're doing in your gardens at home, and encourage you to put pressure on us to keep doing it. So the context of why we are doing some of this stuff, you know, I wanted to just set that scene a little bit and talk about how we became inspired to do some of this, you know, to follow and use the wonderful work of Matt and people like him out there to improve how we're managing trees, but also to kind of help with what happened. This is a photo of the Blue Mountains Botanic Gardens, Mount Tomah, that was taken on by Nearmap in March 2020, so just after the 2019 Black Summer bushfire that impacted the gardens. And as you can see, it doesn't show up so well on this screen, but there's a green oasis in the middle of all of that black. And in the Botanic Gardens world, we often talk about plant blindness. We all whinge at everybody for not seeing the plants, but we're guilty of not seeing the animals and not seeing the other complexities out there. And it's changing, and it's a wonderful thing. And off the back of that horrible event, which affected so many of us, and then we came into the pandemic, like everybody, a lot of us were searching for silver linings. And my arborists, you know, we've got a small team out there, and they're always bringing in funny tree parts into our office. We have a giant pile of wood in our office, and it's just nerdy boffins like us that sort of love it, but every now and then something really special comes in. And this part came in off a failed branch from a Eucalyptus fastigata, a big brown barrel, which is part of the Blue Mountains Basalt Forest ecological community, which is on the mountain over there. And I kind of, in my spare time, polish up pieces of wood and do funny little things, but I didn't do any of the bit here. I didn't do any of the bit inside. I just polished it up to make it look nice, and this sits on my desk. Some sort of parrot did all of that, and you're all welcome to come and have a look afterwards. And I just sanded the sides of it to let a little bit of light in there. And when you look inside it, I was always just amazed at how you can see the curvature of the parrot's beak, doing exactly what Matt talked about earlier. And it just blew me away, and it really got me focusing on the birds and focusing on everything else. I was, like a lot of people, as you get a little older, suddenly you discover bird watching, and I'm no different. And you know, this just blew me away, and that idea that Matt and the guys have been talking about hollows taking a long time. You know, this branch, whilst Australian eucalypt, you can't exactly count the growth rings to age it, it's definitely pushing 50 years. Some of our trees are hundreds of years old, and the tree that I'm going to show you later is sort of one of these brown barrels. And again, like I said, it's part of an endangered ecological community, the Blue Mountains Basalt Forest. So we take that very seriously, and we try and do our best to improve it. But we also saw that after the fires, our garden was an oasis, you know, and we just saw so much bird life coming up. I've been there 10 years, and in the 5 years leading up to it, sure, I was maybe a little bird blind, but we were seeing so many of the nectar feeders coming up. Our garden's full of proteaceous plants, full of nectar producing flowers. The honey eaters are everywhere. But what really got me was the gangs. The creaky door, I just wanted to see one for so long. And they've always been around the garden, but after the fires, we saw so many coming up into the garden. It was also before the La Nina events. We were still in drought for those first few months. And we were seeing them drinking out. This is one feeding in one of the walnut trees that was planted by the Brunette family back in the 1900s, before they donated the land to the government to turn into a botanic garden. And we were seeing all of these trees that are exotics providing an amazing food source to these parrots. We were seeing yellow-tailed black cockatoos coming up and feeding on all the pine cones. And there's just walnuts all over the ground. We were seeing these wonderful little birds feeding in the walnuts in the morning and then flying over to these eucalypts with hollows in them. And I thought they were nesting, but then I noticed a lot of them were actually just drinking from hollows that are formed in crutches of branches, and there was no water around. So, my arborists, we're all nerds, we all love talking about this stuff. We really started to feel we had to do more in this space. And I ended up going over to a Mountains for Habitat little event, which I saw Matt speak at, and I'd heard of the hollow hog, but we got to see it, and straight away we were inspired and we felt we had to go there, but I'll get to that later. But whilst we were also doing that, we were working on a lot of other projects. Plants, I wouldn't be doing my job as a Botanic Gardens representative if I didn't say plants equal habitat. Without plants, habitat isn't just hollows, it's not just homes, it's the food sources, it's the insects that a lot of these animals feed on. This is our World Heritage Centre, rooftop garden. It's a small building that was built to celebrate the inscription of the Greater Blue Mountains World Heritage Area, and on top of it we have this little garden that's on about 150 millimetres of soil profile, all artificial, and it had never been capitalised on. It had never really been planted out with an inspiring group of plants, but as many of you know, the Greater Blue Mountains World Heritage Area, one of the reasons it got that listing was because of its biodiversity and its amazing plant diversity. And the plants you can see there are all Blue Mountain sandstone ridgetop plants. They all grow naturally in tiny little soil profiles on rocky outcrops and rock ledges, and they're so well suited to it. And we want to influence and inspire people to do this sort of stuff, not just use boring Lamandra tanica and other things that you see all around Sydney on rooftop gardens. But what was more important, we wanted to provide habitat. In that alone, we have rocks, which we weren't harvesting from the bush like bush rock. We manage a fire trail network. We manage about 250 hectares of World Heritage Wilderness area. And our fire trails need to get graded and bulldozed, and after the La Nina events, they were heavily damaged. So instead of just letting the rock and some of the other things on those fire trails be bulldozed by a big D7 dozer, we went out and collected some and we installed that into that garden. We also installed deadwood, and already we have skinks, we have all sorts of little animals living up there, so many bees, we see the birds fly in there when everything's in flower. That's Eucalyptus copulans just there, which is an endangered eucalypt from the Blue Mountains, only known from 3 plants which are no longer in existence. We have Acacia mayantha, we have all sorts of different other rare things. We have at least 5 species of terrestrial orchids in up there. So it's habitat for the tiny, tiny little wasps that have the relationships with those orchids, right up through to the birds and skinks, and it just goes on. There's the horticulturist that led it, and that's when we first planted it out. That guy's Stuart Allan, no relation to me, and he was very happy. And that's how many species we've got in it at the moment, just of plants. So just in that space, we have over 40 species of plants, and as I mentioned, some of them are rare. We also have a bog garden, and many of you know the Greater Blue Mountains World Heritage Wilderness Area. One of the contributing things to that inscription was the hanging swamps of the Blue Mountains, and this garden was always planted out in reference to that. And it's habitat for red-bellied black snakes, tiger snakes, and a whole array of frogs that the snakes feed on. And this photo was taken just a couple of weeks ago, and I actually couldn't get the other photo, which was of that red belly right next to a tiger snake at the same time. So just, even though they're venomous and a lot of people are scared of them, it's just as important to create habitat for them. Now this is the Blue Mountains Basalt Forest ecological community. So some of you who know the garden, the highest quality parcel of that inside the cultivated garden bore the brunt of the 2019 bushfire. And this is the regrowth that we've managed. In this area, we've been really careful to balance tree risk with the need for deadwood and perches for the small animals, and in particular for the small birds. In this picture here, you can see just there, whilst the photo doesn't show it so well, is a wonderful natural habitat tree that is used by gangangs. It's got several hollows in it. Yet all the deadwood down below, we see scarlet robins, we see rose robins, we see all sorts of little birds. And it's hard to believe, but after the bushfire in 2019, there was absolutely no understory there. That's all regrowth that we've managed back, and we're contributing to the increase in the Blue Mountain Basalt Forest community there. Just behind where I took that photo, there's a small pile of logs. We're leaving deadwood on the ground. We're trying to mimic what what's out there. We have to help it along. We've got to put that deadwood back there. And I took this photo just the other day, and these, whilst I am certainly not a native bee expert, whilst they might have been wood-boring insect exit holes, they look to be actively in use by some sort of bee. And I was lucky enough to be at a Bush Regenerators Festival last year where there was a bee expert, and he let me know that there's a native bee that exclusively uses the dead flower spikes of xanthorrhoeas. And I was out on our Sandstone Ridgetop Conservation Area the other day, and I was desperately hunting for a xanthorrhoea with a hole in it, and I managed to find one. Don't know whether it was actively being used by a bee, but again, it's super important not to deadhead things, us gardeners that want to clean things up. And of course, leaving forward logs. The logs are habitat for all those invertebrate species, but also for fungi. This is down in our North American woodland, where we unfortunately lost approximately 200 trees and plant species to the impacts of the bushfire. And rather than just clean them all up, we left a lot of the logs around in that area. Royal Botanic Gardens Victoria did a wonderful project where a big white oak failed and they turned it into a seeding area. I strongly encourage everybody to look it up. It's a wonderful thing. Planted habitat, native plants around it. But it, within a year, was colonised by dozens of fungi species. And I think they've done some research and published on it. And it's now up to, I think, over 50 fungi species that have colonised that piece of wood. So again, we've got to provide habitat for the fungi. It's just as important. But now onto our habitat tree creation project. So this tree, it's a big brown barrel, a Eucalyptus vastigata, and unfortunately, we've been monitoring this tree for quite some time. All of our brown barrels up at Mount Tomah seem to be, they are infected or infested with a fungi called Latoporus portentosus. It's also known as the milk punk fungi. It's a brown rot wood fungi. So it only eats the cellulose. And Matt earlier mentioned recovery, reaction wood or adaptive wood on trees. Normally when some other fungi eat timber out and a tree becomes weaker, the tree is able to put wood on, and we see the swellings and the bulges in the tree. Unfortunately, with the brown rot fungus, it eats the cellulose and the tree's not able to do that. So we have no visual indicators as arborists to know whether or not that tree is responding to that. And for many years, we've been watching a colony of Latoporus up in this section, and it gets a really big white bracket on it. And after the La Nina events, we just saw that exponentially fruit. And we do resistograph and some Tychus tomography, very technical arborist things to see how sound that wood is. And it got to the point where we felt we couldn't be assured that the top of that tree wasn't going to fail into the toilet block or picnic shelter here. And all around in these eucalypts, that's where we see all the gangangs. We know that they're drinking from several big hollows. We know that they're nesting somewhere down here. And every year there's one pair that they stay all through winter. We actually don't see them leave. And then through the hotter months, we see up to 10 come in. So we decided we would go to work on this. oh, this is a really important one, and I might just rush through some, but that photo there is from another tree where that's a female gang sitting on a fungi bracket, picking at the beetle that colonises that bracket. And just over here was the male working away on a hollow. So clearly there's something going on there. You know, whether it's mutualism or not, I don't know, but the brackets can be this big. And whether or not that fungi has evolved to signal to the animals that it's there, but clearly the gang is also moving its spores around. And when that fungi attacks the branch, and we go up to it, once it's dried out, we can almost push our hands into it. It's amazing. So we then bought a hollow hog, and we went out and we reduced this tree. And I just want to point out that what's really important in all of this, Matt and the guys have mentioned it, you know, it's so important to get skilled arborists and particularly level 5 consulting arborists involved in your selection of habitat trees, because we understand how to reduce the risk. So by reducing the load off those branches, we're not worried about those branches failing. And once we've reduced it down to something like that, that tree's evolved in 100 km/h winds. You know, it's able, with hundreds of kilograms of weight on those limbs. So if we take that back, the wood is sound, and the wood is going to be sound for a very long time. So first of all, we reduced the tree, and then our arborists, we engaged Matt to come and give us a wonderful workshop, and we practiced really hard on some pieces on the ground. And Matt, we invited some of our wonderful volunteer guides like Elizabeth, who's organised today, and we tried to see that as an education and development thing for our arborists and for our horticultural staff. So we spent a day doing that, and we got our guys up there. And another really important thing was the arborists need to be involved because they understand how to access the tree. It's all fine and good to reduce a tree, but if you can't hang a rope off it anywhere, or if you can't get a cherry picker to it, there's no way of getting up there. And let me tell you, it is very difficult to position yourself on a funny stub of a branch to drill a hollow into it. It takes a lot of practice and a lot of thought, but you have to know how to do it, and you have to know how to climb. So there's another one of our arborists using the little piglet there, making a hollow, and we also use an EWP. Another thing is practice makes perfect, so we use pieces on the ground, and we drilled lots of holes. Most of those are my terrible attempts. But the arborists, while sometimes we're choosing live trees or dead trees, with this tree, one of the things that stood out was what we refer to in arboriculture as natural targets. So often when we're reducing a branch, we reduce it to a natural target, which is the branch collar. But what we were looking for with our hollows were existing beginnings of hollows, and that's because that wound wood or reactive wood that Matt talks about, it's occluding in and it's incredibly strong. The tree is putting that wood on adaptively to make sure it doesn't fail. That's how it's responding. It's not making a conscious choice, it's just responding to that weakness. So if we could find those, it makes it a lot easier, and we're assured in our risk assessments that those hollows are going to be strong. So these are more hollows that the guys worked on. This wasn't particularly, whilst we were aiming at gangs, we just want to make this an education tree, and we hopefully will get uptake by species in it, but we just want as many hollows for as many different things in it as possible. So, and then this one is actually us attempting to make a little microbat hollow below an existing wound that's occluded over. So behind that is probably a pocket of decay, and hopefully a hollow that bats will be able to use. But I also want to point out there's a very big difference between trunk wood and branch wood. So our preference on this tree was to put our hollows into branches, and that's because there's a natural protection point, a physiological barrier to decay that stops decay going into the trunk. And it's a chemical process, there's all sorts of things that go on there. And the reason we prefer that is because once we start going into the trunk, then that can't be compartmentalised from the branches. So if decay gets into the trunk, that's your main structural thing. It's the scaffold that's holding up the tree. So whilst we might do it, and it might be appropriate, for a tree that we want to be there a very long time, if we don't think about it correctly and we put too big a hollow into that trunk and decay gets in, we could be reducing the lifespan of that tree by a considerable time. Because like even, maybe even decades, maybe, a tree that otherwise could have hollows in it and be there for hundreds of years, even if it was dead, if we did it in the trunk, it could be weak and then we'd have no choice but to bring that tree down. So the guys ended up filming and we created this sort of thing, and one reason I put this photo in here is it looks, later on when we look inside the naturally created one by the bird, it really looks like that. It's really interesting. And it made our arborists really happy. Like, our arborists work for the Botanic Gardens because they care about trees. Most arborists do care about trees, even when people think they just want to cut stuff down. And for them to get to do meaningful stuff that's about conservation and positive things, they were just buzzing and they can't wait to do more. So where to next? Basically, this tree's not finished. We've got to get back in there and do a whole lot more work. And it's an ongoing conversation. The guys that Matt's talked about it already, like, by the time Arboriculture Australia made a minimum industry standard about this, and by the time they published that, as you can see there, chainsaw hollows, Matt and the guys had come along with these other techniques and new technology, and it's evolving all the time. The arborists out there are learning so much, the ecologists are informing us on what works and what doesn't. And we're hoping that we can get back to doing a bird survey, like what was done at Mount Tomah back in 2002, and start to really build up the knowledge of what's going on in our gardens beyond the plants, so that we can hopefully really start to achieve some amazing things. And unfortunately, this is right next to that tree. There's the habitat tree we're working on, and the whole time we've been managing the decline of this, the same things led to that decline. The building a farm and a garden around it for 100 years, things we would never do today around a tree. And right now, we're just working out whether or not we turn that into a habitat tree, but at the very least, we'll use all those parts. You know, they're too good to go to waste, just like the guys mentioned before. We'll be either using them elsewhere, we'll be laying that tree down, we might be making a children's playground out of that, we might just make more habitat and connect it to the other tree. But wonderful things are happening in the Botanic Gardens, and please come along, lobby us. Later on in the year, there's a Conservation Society event on the 20th of September. Elizabeth will correct me if I'm wrong. Please come to it. More things will be done by then. So thank you very much.